Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is Know Before You Go, Florida Nature Safari. To help ensure a smooth presentation today, please close all unnecessary browsers and internet-reliant programs, which will reduce strain on your internet bandwidth. Today's presentation is being recorded, so you will receive the replay link in a follow-up email. Today, you've joined us in listen-only mode, which means you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. You have two audio options for listening today, through your computer speakers, or you can dial in on your phone. To switch between the two in your GoToWebinar control panel, select the circle next to your preferred audio choice. If calling in on your phone, be sure to enter in your PIN number. You have the ability to submit questions via the questions field in your control panel. I'll be monitoring your questions today, and at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for a Q&A with our presenter until the top of the hour. If you're joining us on a mobile device, you may need to swipe left or right to switch between the webcam and the slideshow. Okay, let's get started. Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is Know Before You Go, Florida Nature Safari. And it will be presented by our fabulous Nat Hab Expedition Leader, Mike Hillman. Mike, thanks so much for being here today. I know you've got a lot to share, so let's get to it.
Thank you, Sunny. Again, to reiterate what Sunny said, welcome everyone to our webinar today. So let's go ahead and get started. I know you've probably been looking at these cool pictures right here, and this is just kind of a good collage of some of the things we can expect when we head to southern Florida. Now, to kind of start things off, I'd like to introduce myself in case you don't know me. My name is Mike Hillman. I'm an expedition leader with Natural Habitat Adventures since 2017. And I've guided a lot of different trips for Nat Hab, mostly in North America, mostly in the national park system. I've done Florida, of course. I've done Maine. I've done Yellowstone and Grand Teton. I've done the canyons of the Southwest, polar bears in northern Canada, the Alaska departures, Greenland, and even Australia. And so I know quite a bit about Natural Habitat Adventures and the types of trips that we run. And in fact, I was integral into the planning of the Florida Nature Safari when we started it back in 2021. And up to this point, I've led every single departure with varying co-guides. So I know quite a bit about this departure. And so if you have questions, if I don't answer them during the presentation, feel free to ask at the end, and I'm happy to help you out. So to start things off, this is the beautiful state that we get a chance to explore during Florida Nature Safari. Of course, we're going to spend our time here in Florida, in southern Florida. In particular, that's a great place for a lot of people to go. Important to note when we talk about the state that the population is about 22 million people, but they see tourism upwards of 100 million people a year. Now, our goal as Natural Habitat Adventures expedition leaders is to find a way to highlight areas you may not get a chance to see on your own, or to get into some of those off the beaten path areas so we can leave a lot of that 100 million people behind as we explore some really beautiful natural landscapes and the interesting wildlife that Florida has to offer. So this is our departure. It's centered on just South Florida, of course, starting in Fort Myers and working our way all the way down to Key West. We kind of do it planes, trains, automobiles. We throw out the trains, but we add in a bunch of boats in order to see South. In this case, we're in Florida, because you can't talk about Florida in general, and certainly not South Florida, without thinking about being on enjoying the landscape of both the Gulf of Mexico as well as the Atlantic. So to give you an idea of just the types of habitats we get to explore on this, we do everything from the river of grass, the Everglades, through the beautiful beaches and coral reef systems, the wonderful islands of both the Keys and around Marco Island and the 10,000 Islands National Wildlife Refuge, which are surrounded in some interesting aquatic habitats as well, like mangroves, which we spend a lot of time talking about, and even seagrass beds that bring in things like sea turtles and manatees. Speaking of manatees, those are just one of the four what I consider big charismatic megafauna of South Florida. Of course, alligators, that's kind of the big one. I always joke that if I don't show you an alligator on the trip, then I've definitely done something wrong. There's plenty to see and some great views of them. We'll get a chance to go out looking for dolphins during a dolphin cruise, manatees in a few spots, so we'll try to take a look for them. And something you may not be as familiar with, which is called the key deer, which is the smallest subspecies of the white-tailed deer. They're not much bigger than a golden retriever, and so they're really cool to see in the Florida Keys. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the bird life. Not only am I a Nat Hab expedition leader, but I'm also a photography guide as well as a birding guide. These are all my photos, actually. The bird life in South Florida is pretty spectacular, and we'll spend a lot of time looking for and enjoying some of the unique animals. Most of them, as I've talked about, are connected to the water in some way, shape, or form, either working through the wetlands or fishing out of them like an osprey or cormorant does, or even something really interesting like the snail kite, which goes specifically after snails that live in the Everglades. And so the abundance of bird life and the abundance of wildlife in general make this a pretty fun trip for natural habitat adventures. Now, the presentation today is supposed to give you an opportunity to know exactly what you need to know before you arrive on our first day of a departure, or help you kind of get an idea of what to expect. So maybe you haven't booked this trip yet, but you're interested in it and you just want to get a little bit more information. That's my goal today with the presentation. Now, if you have booked this trip, do know that the pre-departure briefing, either you've gotten a physical copy or you've gotten a PDF mailed to you by our folks and the office. This is going to detail a lot of that same information. It's an opportunity for me to explain a little bit more, expound upon that information, as well as give you an opportunity to ask questions at the end if something doesn't quite make sense in that pre-departure briefing. So, as I'm saying, not only will this presentation be recorded and sent out to you for later looking, but if you need to refer back to something, chances are a good bit of this information is in the pre-departure briefing itself. So one thing to start off with and kind of get out of the way is COVID. That's oftentimes on people's mind and they have questions about it. One thing to note is we are relaxing some of our COVID guidelines, but I'm going to kind of keep it vague here because, of course, things change over the next few months, depending on if you're watching this today live or watching it in the future. One thing I want to reiterate is we're always, as natural habitat adventurers, going to follow those local guidelines, whatever they look like. Particularly when we talk about this trip, we're visiting 3 different national parks. And those national parks oftentimes will have different guidelines than even the county that they're in. And so we're always going to make sure we follow those guidelines. Now, to know the most up-to-date information when it comes to your departure, I would go to this website right here, www.nathab.com/COVID-info. That's going to have the most up-to-date information as things evolve over the course of the pandemic. We've been changing constantly, as the counties and government officials have been doing as well. So that's going to be your best spot to get an idea of what to expect before you arrive on our trip. Now, with that out of the way, one of the next things I want to talk about when it comes to booking or expecting what to expect on a Florida nature safari is we kind of do it in 2 different seasons. We do it in the winter and we do it in the spring. And that can offer a few different things when it comes to the seasonality of wildlife and conditions, and certainly the weather, as you would expect. So when we talk about January and February, some things to think about is oftentimes because of the cooler conditions and drier conditions, we oftentimes have fewer mosquitoes and bugs. The cooler temperatures, which can be quite nice, sitting somewhere in the 70s or 60s. But I had one departure, we were in Key West, and it was maybe in the 40s. Everyone was bundled up for the dolphin cruise. It was a very weird thing to see as we were going by palm trees in South Florida. So be expecting or certainly planning for some colder temperatures. Bring some extra layers just in case. Check that weather to see what it's doing. That was particularly a fairly good cold snap, but you never know with Florida weather. Now, in general, there's a little bit less bird diversity than in the spring, but what we get are a lot of birds from the north that have migrated down and they're overwintering. Things like white pelicans would be one example of that. And so while we may not see some of the smaller songbirds as they migrate through, we get a lot of those big, beautiful wading birds hanging out, just riding out the winter in a beautiful place like South Florida. Also, manatees are more likely they like cooler, or rather they like warmer water. And so as temperatures drop, they head inland into the rivers and natural spring areas. And so they're much more readily seen there. As we get into the spring, they head out along the shoreline. And so they're a little bit more spread out. This can also be the case with the types of wildlife that we see. The dry season, which is generally January and February into March, oftentimes because there's less water, these watering holes are more concentrated. So wildlife comes into those areas and sometimes can be easier to see. If you've done an African safari, you know that those watering holes can be super important to seeing wildlife. And while it's not quite to the same extent as it would be in Africa, it certainly helps in having some drier conditions to be able to see more wildlife in each one of the stops we go to. And another side benefit with it being the dry season is there's oftentimes a lot less afternoon storms. If you've been to Florida before or lived in Florida, you know that you can almost set your watch to the 3 p.m. rainstorms that happen, particularly in the summer in Florida. And so by skipping some of that, by being in the dry season, we get a little bit drier conditions, more consistent weather throughout the day. Now, that being said, March and April are some great times to visit South Florida as well. There can be more mosquitoes, more bugs in general, especially in April, depending on what the rain conditions have been doing. But in general, it's never as bad as you would expect for being in a swampy area. We skirt around some of those more concentrated spots where the mosquitoes hang out. And certainly we're not there in the heat of the summer, which is where it gets at its worst. So while it's more, it's not a lot. Also, the weather can be quite nice, warm to even hot in some circumstances, a bit more humid. So it's a bit more enjoyable than it can be potentially in January or February. As I referred to before, the bird migration's coming through, and so we get a higher propensity of smaller songbirds and things like that that move through and maybe get a little bit higher bird list if that's something you're interested in. Because of the warmer temperatures, our reptiles are a bit more active. One being the alligators, you'll see them swimming around more, better chance to see them moving or snapping at fish at a couple of our spots, so that's something to think about. And also, if you think about booking your trip after what is generally spring break in the United States, you can look that up to kind of figure out which week tends to be the biggest this time of year in 2023 coming up. If you go after that, oftentimes there's a lot less people moving through Florida during that time. And finally, another really big benefit is we have an opportunity to get in the water to snorkel and explore the coral reef or mangrove or seagrass ecosystems. And the water is much warmer come March and April than it is in January, I'll tell you that. That being said, we do provide wetsuits in January, February, but it's still a nicer swim come spring. In the pre-departure briefing, this listed as well, just to give you an idea of the kinds of temperatures you're dealing with, both at the start as well as when we get to Key West. So you can see January, February, you're in the mid 70s, lows in the 50s. But you can see that jump up come March, April, into May for that last departure, where you're getting into the mid to upper 80s. That being said, Key West in particular, you think being as south as it is, it would be quite hot in the summertime, but it really doesn't even get above 100 degrees in Key West like it can in the American Southwest. So that beautiful water of the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico and the Florida Bay helps moderate the temperature. So it never gets oppressive, but it certainly gets warm for sure. Something to think about with sunscreen and the like. Now, some things to think about if you've already signed up for the trip is just a reminder, as you're filling out forms, make sure you let us know about any dietary or allergy information. It kind of comes without a saying, but South Florida is chock full of seafood. That's one of the things we like to highlight on this trip. If you have a seafood allergy or a shellfish allergy, you still can do this trip. I've had plenty of people with those allergies come on. Just make sure you let us know in your sign-up forms that this information is imperative to know about, and we'll make sure we work with the restaurants to provide those options for you. And certainly when you're out on the ground, definitely be your own advocate. Talk to the waiters as you're ordering food. Just let them know about your allergies, and we can do our best to take care of you out in the field. In addition, let us know about any medical information, especially if you booked this trip a while ago and things have changed. It's always good to update that information with new medications in the event of emergency. It's useful to know those kinds of things up to date, as well as if you had any surgeries or any issues that have come up. Those things are good to know because then we can work best with you to make sure you can enjoy as much as the trip as possible. And finally, make sure you update your arrival information. I think if you've been traveling at all in the last year or so, the airlines have been very dynamic, let's say, in changing flight times and arrival times, things like that. And it's important to let our staff in the office know, because they let us know about your arrival times, because we're going to be picking you up from the airport if you're flying in. If you drive in yourself, you'll be responsible for getting yourself to the beginning hotel, either driving your own vehicle or using a rental, and just taking a taxi from the rental car service to the hotel. But make sure, just again, make sure that we know your arrival flight information, because as you would expect, that's going to be the best way for us to know what time to come pick you up at the airport. All right, so if you're coming on a Florida nature safari, what does it look like to dress for success? Well, this picture right here, though not from Florida, really highlights what a Florida guest would be wearing out in the field. Having a base layer for sunny weather, because we'll get plenty of that. Number two, very important, is rain gear. I always operate under the mantra that if somebody didn't bring our rain gear, that's why it's raining. So always have that with you, because we want to be able to, rain or shine, explore and enjoy the area that we're in. Only if we start seeing lightning and thunderstorms does it make sense to maybe get off the trail and get back on the road. Now, like I said, especially in January, February, we can have some cold snaps. So make sure you have some extra warmer layers just in case that happens. Or, as often is the case in South Florida in the spring, their air conditioning is a little bit fast, a little bit strong, if you will. So what that means is you could be sitting in on a presentation or at a restaurant, the AC is blasting, makes sense to maybe put on an extra layer. And also putting on a hat for sun. You can say they all have ball caps here, or a nice good broad brim are all great options for you. Here's just a little bit of what that can look like in picture form, because we are going through swampy habitats, we're going through sunny areas, we're out over the open water. I highly recommend quick dry clothing. So if we do happen to get wet, either during a rainstorm or splashing when we're on the boat, that stuff dries very quickly. And having long pants as well as long sleeves not only protects you from the sun, but also helps protect you from any biting bugs if they're particularly bad for you. And having that nice broad brim hat. That being said, if you have your own sunscreen or bug spray that you like to bring, it works for you, have at it. But we'll have plenty of options for both bug spray as well as sunscreen when we're out on the ground. So it's kind of up to you. I usually recommend people bring at least their own face sunscreen, and we can provide the extra sunscreen as you need it. Now, shoe wear in particular, you could bring proper hiking shoes. On this trip, while we're on some trails that have rougher terrain, in that it's gravelly and maybe roots here and there, rocks, those kinds of things, we're not doing any proper hiking like we're in the mountains in the Rockies or anything like that. Most of the time we're on boardwalks, paved paths, gravel paths, things like that. So you can kind of choose footwear that works best for you in those kinds of conditions. And one thing I definitely recommend, having some shoe wear you don't mind getting wet, because we're going kayaking, we're out on boats, having either a sandal or a water shoe with some good grip on it, those kinds of things will be good ideas to bring. Imperative, be it your shoe wear or your rain gear, is test it before you come. This is critical, because I can't tell you how many times I've had guests come on the trip, either to Florida or Greenland or where have you, and they took out their hiking shoes that they wore 4 years ago on a trip, and they're ready to wear them again. And over those 4 years in the closet, the glue has started to degrade, and they literally walk out of the soles of their shoes, or their rain gear doesn't work nearly as good as it should. So highly recommend testing those things, make sure they work. Put your rain gear on in the shower, see if it keeps you dry or not. Don't feel like you need to go out and buy brand new stuff. They actually make sprays and they sell it at typical outdoor stores like REI, where you can spray on your rain gear or spray on your shoes to re-waterproof them. So if they still work just fine, no need to replace them, just add that water repellent layer back. So keep that in mind. You can go into any of the outdoor sports stores and ask them about those kinds of things, and they'll be able to help you out for sure. All right, so what does packing for the adventure look like? Well, in general, we expect guests to be bringing just 2 bags. One is going to be your carry-on or day pack. So that's the bag you'll have on your person in our Sprinter vehicles as we're driving around, and have your basic gear, things like your layers I was talking about, medications, wallet, camera, those kinds of things. And then the other is what we call the checked luggage. So that's the piece of luggage we give to our operations team on the ground, and they're going to be then carting it between locations. Now, I highly recommend that that's soft-sided luggage. Reason being, it's easier for us to stack and keep track of when we're out on the ground, and a little bit lighter and a little bit less cumbersome for you moving in and out of hotel rooms. So recommend that. Definitely recommend wheels or a nice good handle, those sorts of things. Now, if you're a photographer, you can definitely break this rule. I know some folks really have a nice, good, dedicated camera bag they want to bring in addition to their carry-on or day pack, and that's fine. I would just try to be mindful of the size of that, how much equipment you're bringing along. It may make sense to actually keep that in the back of our vehicles, and then when we stop at locations, you can get it out of the back and utilize it, because while there is a decent amount of room in the vehicles, space can be limited from time to time, especially with what other folks are bringing as well. Now, this departure, as you kind of got an idea of, and we'll talk about the itinerary here in just a minute, this departure gives you an option for both wildlife photography, underwater photography, and some landscape photography. So you want to be thinking about the kind of camera gear that you can bring that may give you some different options. So depending on your photography style, what you're hoping and getting in, I would bring a nice good zoom lens, and unless you're a really staunch nature landscape photographer that wants a big wide open angle, I would probably shoot for a wide angle no bigger than the one you see on the screen here, which is the 24 to 70. I wouldn't go any wider than that necessarily. I don't think it's typically necessary unless you yourself have a style that lends to something like a 16 to 35 or wider than that. So having a nice medium to wide angle, as well as a good zoom lens, are things to think about for sure. But with that in mind, as we've talked about, we're on the water quite a bit. And so if you think you are going to bring a lot of your camera gear on each of those different activities, I would definitely recommend looking into the best way to keep your camera gear dry during those scenarios. Some of the boats really don't have much in the way of water splash, some do. We can talk about those when we're on the ground. But having good rain gear, let alone for the boats, but for the weather itself, is going to be imperative for your camera gear to keep it dry and working throughout the entire departure. Now, if you're interested in wildlife watching, binoculars, of course, are a good idea. Now, one thing to note is our team on the ground will be providing binoculars for every single guest, as well as spotting scopes are going to be available to utilize when we're out in the field to be able to look at birds and other wildlife as we're going along. If you have your own pair of binoculars, feel free to bring them. Not only are you more comfortable with those binoculars that will work best for you, you'll be able to have them always on you. But don't feel like you need to bring that if you're thinking about weight as you're flying down to South Florida. Binoculars are something you can leave off the list. We've got you covered unless you want to bring your own because you have a special preference. And so you can see here on the left of the screen, that's me with one of our vehicles we'll drive in South Florida. It's a Mercedes Sprinter, is what we've got this year in 2023. And there's plenty of room. We'll have at most 7 guests per vehicle, which is about half capacity for those vehicles. So there's plenty of room. Everyone will get a window seat that wants one, and plenty of room to store some gear as we're moving along. And something to note with our restaurants in South Florida, we're going to eat at a variety of different places. I've spent the last couple of years over numerous departures kind of tweaking and finding the best restaurants with the best foods that work best with us. Some cases, those restaurants allow us to see it as a group. Some will have us at little 4 tops or 2 tops, depending on what people are interested in. But this is a beautiful spot here. This is a picture I took from Calusa, which is at Baker's Cay Resort in Key Largo. Just a stunning overlook of the Florida Bay and some of the islands of the Florida Keys. So be definitely looking forward to the food in addition to the wildlife. Accommodations are another interesting aspect. This is actually a room from the Almond Tree Inn in Key West, and you can see some lovely accommodations there. We stay at Baker's Cay Resort, as I just talked about, another great spot. And so we try to find some places that not only are the best in the area, but also provide an opportunity to be the closest to some of our activities so that we can maximize our time out in the field, enjoying the nature versus driving back and forth to the best accommodation in the area that's an hour away from where we want to be. So it's definitely a balance, but I think we found some really great spots to go to. And something to note is island time. We are in Florida, in Marco Island, and throughout the Florida Keys. Island time is very a real thing, so make sure you bring your patients along, pack that, because as you've probably experienced if you've done any travel during the era of COVID, people are understaffed, things are taking longer, and so just keep that in mind. And while we try to sneak around some of those busy times of the year in Florida, it is Florida, and so we can see traffic. We try to minimize that as much as possible, but lines like these can happen, particularly if there's an accident or something like that. All right, so this is another good thing to note. So these pictures right here, these 5 pictures are the 5 boats we'll be utilizing on the trip, the exact boats. So take a good look at these pictures to get an idea of what kind of boat experience we can have. In the upper left corner, that yellow boat, that is our snorkeling boat. So you can see that size. We've got an airboat, kayaking, some singles, mostly tandems. We've got a pontoon boat that we take when we're in Marco Island. And one of my personal favorites here in the center, this is the Squid. It's a solar powered boat that we utilize out of Key West to do dolphin watching. So it's pretty sweet to be able to do that all electric powered when we need it to be. Now, with that in mind, if you're someone who gets seasick or doesn't like the water, be aware of that. Make sure you're coming with strategies to help combat that as best as possible. One option is Dramamine. I highly recommend getting the non-drowsy version of that so you can actually enjoy what you're trying to stay away from seasickness. Or whatever other strategy, be it the pressure point bracelets or just some ginger candy, whatever that looks like to you, make sure you come with those options. That being said, in some of those circumstances, it's easy to sit out of some of these, like the snorkeling or the kayaking, those sorts of things. Are possibilities to sit out if you're not big into boats, but just do know that is a big part of this departure because you're in South Florida where water is king. All right, so another question I'm kind of trying to head off. You might have heard in the news that Florida got hit pretty hard by hurricanes this season, in particular Hurricane Ian, and centralized a lot of the damage in areas around Fort Myers and Sanibel. In fact, that's why we've made some changes to 2023 to actually circumvent some of the hardest hit areas. And this was a pretty big storm. We're talking wind gusts got upwards of 215 miles per hour, so very, very fast, very destructive, and left in its wake about $50 billion in damages. So it's going to take years potentially for Florida in those regions to really bounce back to pre-hurricane times. If you saw on the news, Sanibel in particular was cut off from the mainland. The storm surges there actually removed sections of the bridge that we used to drive out there as part of our departure. And so even Sanibel and the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge was damaged too. And so we've circumvented that. We're no longer adding Sanibel because actually up in currently through December at least, they're not allowing anyone on the island that doesn't work there or doesn't live there. So tourism, of course, is not an option. They need time to rebuild, as you would expect. And Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge, because of that, is also closed indefinitely. We'll hear when they're able to reopen, but it probably won't be for months. So with that in mind, we've made some changes to the itinerary on the front end, which I'll talk about. But actually see, while we're missing some things with Sanibel, we get some things in return. And so while it may be a different departure, I think it can be equally as good and certainly maximize our opportunities to see the natural landscapes and the wildlife that we have here. So rather than starting our trip in Sanibel, we're actually going to start it in Fort Myers proper, which is actually the way we started it early on when we started this trip back in 2021. And so we're going to be arriving and staying in Fort Myers, and that provides its own benefits. That's a great place to be close and simple moves back and forth to the airport, which is great for making short drives from the airport to your hotel. Just makes it easier on you if you've been traveling all day. But in addition, it provides opportunities to be near things like the main street here in Fort Myers, which has some lovely restaurants and shops, as well as some of the different attractions, be it museums, gardens, things like that. While we are missing Sanibel, we get a chance to explore Fort Myers, which up to this point we've been mostly driving through. And Fort Myers in itself is quite an interesting spot and provides you a great launching pad for the rest of the trip. Then from there, we're going to head down through central Florida and start heading towards the coastline of Marco Island. But in the meantime, we're going to be stopping to look for manatees. There's a couple spots in mind that we might have good luck with them. You can never guarantee it. It's very weather-based, as I've talked about. The water temperatures are king when it comes to trying to find manatees. But we'll spend some effort there in the morning of day 2 after our welcome dinner. But then something that we haven't done up to this point is visit Audubon Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. This is a spot that we traditionally haven't had time to visit, and so we've been driving right by it. But now this is a natural landscape protected by the Audubon. I would say equally as famous as Ding Darling, and give an opportunity to see that habitat and see some of the wildlife in the swamp ecosystem that's everyone knows that is South Florida. And so I'm super excited to add that to our departure. It's a great spot for bird watching, great spot to look for alligators and other interesting wildlife. And so it's exciting to add that to our itinerary. Now, pretty much from there, everything you see after this is going to be pretty similar. One of the benefits or one of the things that we see coming out of Hurricane Ian is that most of the destruction, most of the changes were relegated to the Sanibel, Fort Myers area. And so what that means is that the rest of the departure, while we will see aspects or will see damage, what we'll see is that the rest of the itinerary can run as it has in years past. We may be able to point to, oh, this mangrove used to have more leaves in it over on this side or something like that. But overall, the actual infrastructure and getting a chance to do the activities we want to do remains the same following the hurricane, which is super interesting. So day 3, we get a chance to explore Marco Island in more detail. In the morning, we'll get a chance to kayak through the mangroves, as you can see there. And then in the afternoon, probably my personal favorite activity of the trip is we do a sunset bird cruise and beach walk. So in the afternoon, we'll go out on that pontoon boat I was talking about and head out over to a barrier island where we get out, go on the beach, walk around, do some shelling if you're interested in something like that, collect some shells, and then we get back in the boat and then we head towards a small island, not much bigger than like a cafeteria size room. And that island houses hundreds of wading birds, things like ibis and egrets and herons, and those birds roost there for the evening. And so we set ourselves up, we anchor on next to the island, and we have our charcuterie dinner while we watch the sunset and we watch the birds fly in over top of us and around us as they land on the island. So it's a really magical experience to see all of that all around the same time. So one of my personal favorite days is that day on Marco Island, just because of that alone. Day 4, we move from Marco Island and we head to Key Largo, which means driving across southern Florida through the Everglades and Big Cypress National Preserve. And so we get a chance to see some of those aspects. We do our airboat ride, we get gators, if you haven't seen them up to that point. We spend some time walking through Everglades National Park and some of the beautiful boardwalks and some of the interesting swamp ecosystems that we see there. And even actually make a stop for lunch at Robert is Here fruit stand. If you're from Florida, you're probably familiar with that. Very famous fruit stand here in South Florida. Then day 5. Day 5, we are headed from Key Largo. We're going to stay there 2 nights in Key Largo. Another benefit of this trip, once we leave our entry hotel in Fort Myers, we're at 2 nights at each hotel after this. We're not traveling too much day to day, but this day we're actually going to head off of Key Largo and head to Biscayne. If you're not familiar, Biscayne National Park, it's the 3rd national park we've added to this departure. It's actually in basically southern Miami. From the areas we get a chance to snorkel and explore, we can see the Miami skyline. But this is a wonderfully preserved national park that's overwhelmingly water. There's just this few islands that make up the land of this national park. The rest of it is water, which means to explore it and to enjoy it, you have to be on a boat, be in the water, snorkeling around, looking for interesting fish and the mangrove ecosystems and things like that. So this is a wonderful day to explore that. We'll come back with enough time to also enjoy the resort that's beachside here in Key Largo. So it's a pretty fun day as well. Then from there, we head from Key Largo all the way through the rest of the Keys and make our way down to Key West. And one of our big goals on this day is to find the key deer. As I talked about earlier, this is the smallest subspecies of the white-tailed deer, no bigger than a golden retriever. And we'll spend some time exploring some natural trails, trying to find them there. Or oftentimes is the case, the best place to find them is actually walking through some of the neighborhoods or driving through some of the neighborhoods nearby the Key Deer National Wildlife Refuge. Because just as they made you in the rest of the United States go into Mrs. Smith's house to go after the begonias, they kind of do that as well in the Keys. So we'll take a look in people's yards along some natural landscapes and try to find some key deer, which are always fun to see how small they can be. Then from there, once we get into Key West, we're going to be getting on the squid, as I talked about. You can see the solar panels on the boat right there, and spend some time out around Key West, motoring around with our electric motor and trying to find some dolphins. We may have some opportunities in Marco Island to try to find them there, but we'll spend even more time looking for them and oftentimes learning from their crew, which are very knowledgeable about the dolphins in that area. And we get to learn some more, as well as get some new views of dolphins in some very beautiful teal and blue water. Then day 7, we're nestled in Key West. And this is the day to head out and go to Dry Tortugas National Park. And so if you're not familiar, this is the most remote national park in the lower 48. And it's a 70-mile excursion from Key West over the open water west to head out to the very last of the Keys, if you will, which is our Dry Tortugas National Park. You can see the historic in the photo, which is an opportunity to explore that and learn the very interesting history of it, as well as it's a premier birding spot because this is an island in the middle of nowhere. So any bird that's migrating across the ocean or the Gulf of Mexico, if you will, needs to land there and rest for a minute before continuing on. So it's a good spot to look for birds, as well as opportunities to even snorkel from the beach lines there and see some wonderful various tropical fishes like tangs and parrotfish. Now, the goal is to take a seaplane out there, a short 40-minute flight or so from Key West over to Dry Tortugas. Something new that we're adding this year is we want to make sure everyone gets a chance to get out there. And so in addition to the seaplane, we have a backup. There is a larger public ferry that goes out there every day. Usually the seaplane speeds ahead of that and lands and checks it out. But we've got ourselves booked on both the seaplane as well as the ferry. So for any reason why water conditions or wind conditions may negate the seaplane, we have the backup, which is the ferry as well, which is something new we're adding this year because we just want to make sure everyone gets a chance to get out there and explore this very unique part of South Florida. Now, once we get back to Key West, we have opportunities to actually explore the town itself. And so we'll set folks loose to be able to go to the various museums and institutions. I have in the picture down here the Hemingway House of Ernest Hemingway. A lot of folks like to go check that out and see not only the history that he has, but also his cats, which are very famous if you're not familiar. So opportunities to explore the town before we finish up with our farewell dinner. Now from there, day 8 is when we depart from Key West onto wherever your next destination may be. Be it either you could fly out of the Key West airport or even take the ferry from Key West back to Fort Myers and then continue on from there. Both options are available to you. So it's a really fun week. It's an opportunity to maximize our time in some very unique ecosystems and see as much wildlife as possible. This is personally one of my favorite trips that I do for Natural Habitat Adventures. Not only is the weather awesome, but the wildlife is too. So with that, I'm going to open it up to any questions that you may have. If we don't have an opportunity to answer your questions, do note down there, concierge@nathab.com is a great place to email any additional questions that you may have.
Mike, thank you so much. That was fabulous. and informative, and I'm sure everybody feels prepared and excited to join you down there very soon. I want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. Let's start with photography. You mentioned you're an avid photographer and an excellent photographer based on those images. This person is also interested in photography and wondering if they'll be disappointed in the amount of photo ops since it's not an official photography tour.
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, it is not an official photo departure. That may be something we do in the future, add some photo departures. I think it could definitely warrant that. I think really, if you're thinking about if you're going to be disappointed or not, it's all a mindset thing. We won't have the opportunity, like on a traditional photo departure, to line everyone up and spend some time in one spot taking photos. So kind of keep that in mind. But with that, though, you still have plenty of opportunities for photography for various wildlife. We've had a number of great photo guests on each of these departures, and I think they've gotten some great photos. All the photos I'm cycling through here are mine that I took while with guests, showing them things, obviously helping them with their cameras as well. And so those photo ops are there, but yeah, it will be different than a traditional photo departure. And so just be mindful of that, be respectful of other folks as they're taking a look at stuff as well. I would recommend, if you want to do a trip like this and focus on photography, is get really good with your camera to be able to take quick shots, because depending on the spot and exactly what we're seeing, you may not have time to focus for 20 minutes in one spot with one subject. And so being a little bit more quick on the draw is going to be pretty helpful. And that's how I get these shots, is getting popping a few shots off and talking about what we're seeing as we're going along as well. So just be a good mindset, as well as being proficient in your gear is going to maximize your photo opportunities when you're out there in the field.
Great advice, thank you. Another viewer is interested in snorkeling. Do you provide life vests on this trip, or is that something guests will need to bring?
No, yeah. As far as snorkeling is concerned, the only thing you need to bring is your own swimwear, be it a top or swim trunks, whatever that looks like to you. So everything else is provided to you. Depending on the time of year, they provide wetsuits. Depending on the departure, we also, I shouldn't say depending on, wetsuits if it's in the wintertime. But other than that, you will get snorkel mask, snorkel itself. You'll get a little flotation style life vest, and even fins too. So that's all taken care of. If you want to bring an underwater camera, feel free to do so. I would recommend testing it again, just like your other gear, ahead of time. We had several guests over the course of the last couple of years leading these trips that their camera isn't quite working the way they're hoping it to. It's leaking, or they can't quite figure out the buttons underwater. So test that stuff. Just fill your bathtub up, even put a couple rocks or something down and try to take pictures of them underwater. Just get proficient with your camera. That's going to make it a lot easier when you're in the water actually swimming around, because there's going to be a lot of activity, be it other swimmers as well as the wildlife, and the being just mindful of where you are in the water. So the more proficient you are with the camera, again, the better your shots are going to come out. You're going to have more opportunities to take pictures. Just in recap, the only thing you really need to bring is your swimwear. We've got you covered on everything else.
Sounds good. Can you share again what the water temperatures are in the two different seasons?
Yeah, so it will vary a lot. So I hesitate to give exact numbers, but we're talking in the 60s to 70s, maybe mid 80s Fahrenheit. So the 60s and low 70s will be more January, February. The mid higher 70s to 80s is typical for the more spring temperatures. It's proper summer when you get really nice warm water, like 84 to 90, those kinds of things, which can happen. Yeah, we always try to recommend, or we always try to plan that our snorkeling opportunities, the boat's right there. And so when you get out in the water, you can go for as long as you feel comfortable, and then get right back in the boat. I find if you're getting cold, just exercising a little more, a few more kicks, those kinds of things help warm you up. In the winter, having that wetsuit definitely helps things as well. If you have an additional swim shirt or something like that, even those layers can help to a certain extent. So That's kind of
Okay.
generally what temps are. But like I said, it will vary a lot depending on the weather conditions.
Okay. You mentioned kayaking. If someone's never been kayaking, will there be enough instruction, or do you recommend a kayaking lesson before
Oh,
arriving
yeah.
at the trip?
I always recommend doing some kayaking ahead of coming on any trip that has kayaking on it, just so you feel more comfortable. Every circumstance, if somebody's at least comfortable on the boat, understanding a little bit when it comes to the paddling, that's going to make their experience more enjoyable. That being said, if that opportunity is not available to you easily, like if you're coming from Arizona or something like that, where there isn't a lot in the way of water to go paddle around in, fear not, we will give you plenty of instruction. We can even partner you up in a tandem with someone that's a bit more experienced. Those are options available to you as well. And so we can get you out on the water and experiencing it quite well. But at the end of the day, a little more experience coming in means you're going to enjoy the experience even more while you're there.
Great advice. Okay. How likely is it to see a spoonbill?
So that one is a trickier bird. And the reason why is, unlike some of the other species that congregate and stay in certain areas, the spoonbill oftentimes can be a bit more vagrant, meaning that they'll fly to one wetland one day, but they won't be there the next day. And even the time of day and the tides are pretty critical to that oftentimes. And so it can vary a lot departure to departure, how many spoonbills we see or what kind of conditions. In some cases, we've had trips that it's just a spoonbill flying over the Everglades. We get a decent glimpse of. On other cases, we may have them up close for as long as we want at one of our wetland stops. So it can be quite variable with that. So I wouldn't say any time of year is better than any other. Just know that each view of them is pretty special.
Sounds good. Here's a quick one, maybe. Do you have size 16 men's flippers, or is that something that that person should bring with them?
That is a good question. I wouldn't know. Reason being is we utilize partners on the ground for that equipment. And so what I would suggest is your adventure specialist or concierge, talk to them about that. And what they can do is then contact the partners on the ground and confirm whether or not they have that gear. And if not, maybe it makes sense to bring your own.
Sounds good. Do you keep the guests busy all daylight hours, or is there time for long beach walks? How many hours a day for walking and town explorations would you estimate?
Right. So this trip runs a lot differently than typical trips. If you've done a trip internationally, say in Southern Africa, South Africa, or Botswana, something like that, oftentimes you're getting up at the crack of dawn and you're out through sunset. And so this trip is a little bit different than that because we're not covering the same distances on each one of our game drives, if you will, as they would in Southern Africa. And so we're, as I like to say, we're a bit nicer to the guests on this departure. The times are a bit nicer. We may have some early mornings, but we have some later mornings, or we have some early evenings. And so in those circumstances, there are plenty of opportunities and plenty of space to take breathers, take showers after kayaking, as well as explore on your own our options, be it on Marco Island, around Fort Myers, and even Key West. And so those are definitely times we'll provide plenty of times for breaks and resets so that we can maximize the good time when we've got it and people are energized for those.
Okay, great. Tell us about sharks. Should we be concerned about sharks when we're snorkeling?
No. Sharks are a bit vilified when it comes to those kinds of things. One of my biggest pet peeves as a naturalist, particularly in Florida, is the term you hear on the news, shark-infested waters. That's like saying moose-infested forest. So it's just where they live. So you can't really infest something that you live in normally. And so sharks are something to be aware of, but very rarely do we see sharks when we're out snorkeling. In most instances, like dry tortugas is an example where sharks are a bit more common, but still I've seen maybe a couple over all these departures. And oftentimes they're smaller because they're more nursery type system. So it's nothing really to worry about at all. But when we're out in the ground, we can just give some quick tips on just understanding shark behavior, what to do in the water around sharks, those kinds of things. One of the biggest things is just don't swim through a giant school of fish where you get obscured by the fish and the sharks could be going towards that school. Just swim around, keep yourself visible. And if anything, a fish to be that oftentimes surprises folks are the great barracudas. They can be large, anywhere between 2 to 5, almost 6 feet. I've seen one. And they like to swim around people, particularly because we scare fish. And so they do not mess with people at all. The only times people have been bit by barracudas is because it's a fisherman or a scuba diver that's chasing them around. So as long as you're going about your day, they just follow around because you might scare some fish up they may go after, something like that. But it's an opportunity to see some really interesting wildlife in their habitats. And so those snorkel experiences are one of my favorite things to do. All my co-guides can attest. I'm usually the first one in the water and the last one out because of how cool it is to be in that ecosystem.
Oh, sounds amazing. Some logistics. What is the maximum number of guests on each departure?
Yeah, so on each departure, it's typically set at 14 as the max. Occasionally, we have some departures where they cap it at 7. I think there might be an opportunity for that here in 2023. There's one departure, I think, that's set up like that. If you want to be specific on your trip, you can always talk to your adventure specialist, and they'll let you know for sure what you're looking at. But 14 is the max.
Okay, sounds good. Last question. Do you anticipate an opportunity to go deep sea fishing from the Keys?
So it wouldn't be an opportunity that we would be doing with the entire group. That being said, if it's something you're really keen on doing, there can be some chances, or we may offer some help in trying to book something like that once we're on the ground in the Keys. Or wouldn't be a bad idea, talk to your the folks in the office, get an idea of the schedule on either day 7, which is the last full day, which is the Dry Tortugas Day, or I would actually probably recommend staying a day later, so an additional day in Key West, and adding that for that day 8, if you will. So that would be probably your best opportunity. Otherwise, if you're doing it on the day 7, there's a good chance you're going to be missing something, be it some of your additional exploration time of Key West or the actual Dry Tortugas portion. So just be mindful of that, but it's certainly something that you could do while you're in Key West. I would recommend just trying to stay an extra day, day 8, booking it for that day. Honestly, booking early is not a bad idea. And so once we have our farewell dinner on day 7, day 8 is just basically driving people to the airport, getting them on their way. And so that's a day, if you stay an additional one, which we've had guests do, it's an easy day to book something entirely different that you want to add to your experience. And so that's what I would recommend. Nat Hab can even help potentially with booking or talking to the hotel for you and getting some of that set up.
Sounds good. Well, Mike, thanks again for sharing all that information. I'm going to turn it back to you for closing comments.
Perfect, thank you. So again, hopefully from these pictures and from this presentation, you've had an opportunity to learn a little bit more of what this Florida Nature Safari works and looks like, as well as understand how best to prepare for this experience. I think understanding that water is a big aspect of it, getting out either swimming or paddling or being on boats is the best way to experience South Florida. And hopefully you come gung-ho for an adventure, as well as exploring some of the unique wildlife and unique nightlife or what have you of places like Key West. It's a really stunning place. I really enjoy a trip like this. And so I hope that you'll be able to come down and we'll be able to share what makes South Florida so unique and why it's a great idea to go with a group like this to be able to get the most bang for your buck as you're exploring this unique area. So hopefully we'll see you down there. Thanks so much.
I also want to thank everyone who tuned in today. Please join us again actually next week. We don't have a webinar planned for tomorrow. So next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.